And looking on the defensive side of the ball, NFC East, I've gone with Blake Martinez, the linebacker from the New York Giants. I don't know how long he was at Green Bay actually, but he was a pretty good servant for the Green Bay Packers for a long time, and they let him go. And he moved over to New York, and he had just a very good season. A lot of linebackers, nothing outrageous in terms of specific stat, but just very well rounded in each category. His main stat would probably have to be 10th most solo tackles in the league, which is pretty impressive. But yeah, he was probably, I guess you could say, the quarterback of a very good defense there in New York. Honorable mentions go to Montez Sweat and Chase Young. Both were causing havoc on that Washington D line. But yeah, very impressive years from those two as well. And my defensive MVP candidate from the NFC North is got to be Roquan Smith. He had an incredible year, the linebacker from the Chicago Bears. We all knew coming into this year he was one of the better linebackers going around, but this year I think he really established himself as one of the very best. He had 98 solo tackles, which was second in the NFL. He had 18 tackles for a loss, which is second in the NFL as well, which is pretty impressive from the linebacker position. You would expect edge rushers or defensive ends to have the most tackles for losses, so very impressive from Roquan Smith. And he was the Chicago defense had another stellar year, and he was another vital reason why that defense ticks so well. Honorable mentions have to go to Za'Darius Smith, who had another cracking year. On the Green Bay D-line, he's been pretty incredible since they've picked him up. Eric Wilson from the Vikings had a pretty good year, and Khalil Mack probably wasn't quite at his destructive best, but he was pretty impressive for most of the season as well. The NFC South, this was a very impressive defensive division in the end. Probably wouldn't have been expecting it going into the year. You would have thought Atlanta and Carolina would have had pretty poor defenses, but in the end, pretty much all four of the teams had good or above average defenses. Not sure if we can say that about Atlanta, but I'll say it. But for me, the MVP nominee is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers linebacker, Devin White. In his second year in the league, he had an absolute blinder. He had a pretty good year in his first year, and I think he had pretty high expectations coming into this one, and he didn't disappoint. Third most tackles for losses in the NFL, third most solo tackles in the NFL, and that whole Tampa Buccaneers defense, they had a few off games, but Devin White was a consistent performer in that linebacker slot, and I'm looking forward to seeing what he can do in the Super Bowl along with the rest of his Buccaneer defensive teammates, because they're really going to have to trouble Mahomes if they're going to try and win that game. But a lot of honourable mentions have to go out in this NFC South division. It was very competitive, especially in terms of individual defensive players. Lavonte David, another Buccaneers linebacker, Foysaid Oluokun, not sure if I'm saying that right, from the Falcons, Deion Jones, Jason Pierre-Paul, and Malcolm Jenkins all had very impressive years and were a big reason why the NFC South was pretty good this year. And then in the NFC West, you could probably have guessed it, but it's Aaron Donald. I was actually surprised. A lot of my things are based on statistics, and Jalen Ramsey, probably similar to Jair Alexander, actually. And I'm sure there was some in the AFC episode, but lockdown corners, unfortunately, they're more of an eye test, a bit like an O-lineman. There's not really stats that back them up that much, because usually they're just locking down a player so the ball doesn't go to them too much. So Ramsey's probably been underappreciated here by me with the stats, but Aaron Donald is my defensive MVP candidate from the NFC West. Finished the year with 13.5 sacks, which was the second most in the NFL, 14 tackles for a loss, 28 QB hits, which was the fourth most in the NFL, and 4 forced fumbles. So pretty incredible stats, and when you factor in he's probably copying a double team on 80% of his snaps, that's pretty bloody impressive from Aaron Donald. We've come to just expect it every week, but we probably need to sit back and take notice of how impressive it is. And honourable mentions go to Budda Baker. He is probably next to the Honey Badger, one of the biggest primetime fiends I've ever seen in defense. He absolutely lit it up whenever the Cardinals had a primetime game. I'm picturing that game against Seahawks where he just went cut loose. but I'll talk about that game later. So he also deserves a big shout out because he had another really impressive year. So the candidates are Blake Martinez, Roquan Smith, Devin White, and Aaron Donald. I'm actually not going with Aaron Donald, which most people probably would go with. I'm not going with Devin White. Sadly, Blake Martinez is a little bit off the pace, but I'm going with Roquan Smith as my defensive MVP of the NFL. Of the NFC, sorry. He had an absolute blinder of a year. In pretty much every stat, it's pretty impressive, so it's tough to ignore. A linebacker having the second most tackles for a loss in the competition is very impressive. And I actually have TJ Watt finishing above him in terms of the NFL defensive MVP rankings, but Roquan Smith is my number 2, so yeah, incredible year, but also big shout out to Devin White and Aaron Donald because they had very impressive. Now moving on to the defensive MVP award for the AFC. I'm going to do the same system, roll through the divisions. If we're going to look at the AFC East first, once again, not too many options in this one, if I'm honest. The AFC East, they had some solid teams, but not too many star-studded players. But this was easy choice. Xavier Howard, most interceptions on the season with 10, most passes defended with 20. He had a bit of a down year last year, but he went back to his career best form, really, that he was so dominant within around 2017, 2018. And yeah, he just showed that he's probably one of, if not the best cornerbacks in the league. They signed Byron Jones in the offseason, so he thought maybe less importance was going to be put on his lockdown role and that they were going to be more of a tandem. But I think, if anything, that allowed Howard to kind of be a bit riskier in some of his play, and he really stood out this year as one of the best players on that Dolphins team and in the AFC in general. So he is definitely the defensive candidate for defensive MVP out of the AFC East. Shout out though to Jordan Poyer. I always think it's Brian Poyer, but then I'm getting confused with Brian Hoyer. But yeah, Jordan Poyer had a pretty good season for the Buffalo Bills as well. AFC North Defensive Player of the Year. I don't think this is any debate really. Actually, there is a few good players in this one. I can't say that with such confidence. But TJ Watt for me, outside linebacker from the Steelers. Most sacks in the year out of the whole NFL with 15. Most tackles for losses out of the whole NFL with 23. And most QB hits in the whole NFL with 41. So 3 pretty important stats, especially when it comes to pass rushing, and he's leading the NFL in them all. So pretty hard not to have him in here. I do think tackles for losses is a seriously underrated stat because a tackle for a loss is essentially the same as a sack. It's just a running back, not a quarterback. So the fact that he's leading sacks and tackles for losses, that's pretty impressive. And for me, he's the clear candidate out of the AFC North. Big shout-outs, though, to Marlon Humphrey. Had a really impressive year. I think he had 8 forced fumbles, which is pretty incredible. And, yeah, he just put on a clinical year. Myles Garrett as well. He was very impressive once again. 12 sacks, 18 QB hits, 10 tackles for a loss, 4 forced fumbles. So he had another wrecking year for the Browns. And Stephon Tuitt also had another pretty good year. Moving into the AFC South, there was a little bit less to choose from here. There was a lot of depth in the AFC South's defensive ranks, but not necessarily that certified gun. I've actually gone with probably a lesser-known player, but Joe Schobert, linebacker of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He just had really well-rounded stats. Nothing really jumps off the paper. He had the 11th most solo tackles on the year with 84. And yeah, he just had a really impressive year, very well-rounded, as I mentioned. 6 tackles for a loss, 2 forced fumbles, 3 interceptions. He just, ticked every box in terms of every stat. And yeah, without him, I'm not sure how bad that Jacksonville defense could have got because he was really carrying them. He was a signing this year, so we'll talk about him in signings of the year definitely later. Honourable mentions in the AFC South. Similar to offense, they have a lot of depth in that division. JJ Watt had another very good year. I can't lie, I thought he was kind of past his best, especially after the injuries he'd had, but this year he was well and truly dominating games again. 17 QB hits, 14 tackles for a loss. Darius Leonard, similar. He was out for most of last year with an injury, but he came back and was one of the best linebackers in the comp. Kenny Moore was great. DeForest Buckner, Zach Cunningham, and Malcolm Butler. Is it Malcolm Butler? Yeah, I'm not sure why I'm getting confused with that, but yeah, the cornerback from the Tennessee Titans. They all had very good years. And the AFC West, to finish off, this was definitely the weakest division in terms of defense. The only guy worth mentioning is Justin Simmons, really, but he was one of the lower ranked defenders I had mentioned for this award. He was top 5 in interceptions in the NFL, top 20 for solo tackles, but yeah, nothing outstanding from him, just pretty well rounded, similar to Schobert, so he continued to be one of the better safeties in the league. And I remember that clutch interception, was it against the Chargers maybe? I can't remember, they had a game come down to the wire, maybe it was the Falcons, I'm not sure, but he saved the game. Yeah, that's just what he does, so he is the final nominee, but overall, I'm going to have to go with, I can't lie, it's not even close for me, it's TJ Watt. To lead the league in those three of the most important defensive stats, for him to lead the league in that, and I'm telling you what, he does not just lead them, he absolutely obliterates everyone in those stats. I think QB hits, he was had 10 more than the next best. Tackles for a loss, he had 5 more, so yeah, he's an absolute wrecker, TJ Watt, and he is deserving of the AFC Defensive Player of the Year.
Queensland, it's a miracle! Oh yeah! What about that one? No! Unbelievable! Balotelli, Aguero! Crowd cheers. Here's Siddle.